Hello, this is Jonathan Lampel, and in this video tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to make some pretty cool explosions in Blender. Now this is something that a lot of people have asked for, and everybody likes explosions, so I figured now would be a good time to make a tutorial because there have been a few recent improvements to Blender that have really helped us along in making smoke effects. So as I'm sure you know, a year or so ago, in 2012, there was some improvements to the smoke sim coded by Mika H. But just recently, in the last 2 weeks or so, he's added a couple small tweaks that have really boosted the quality of smoke animations and just made everything a little bit easier to work with. So before I go into how to make an explosion, I'm going to be showing you the improvements that he's made, and so we'll be able to watch for these things as we're working through. So first of all, these are in only the very recent versions of Blender, so it has to be after 2.67a, and that means that you have to go to builder.blender.org and download whatever version you need from there. So it's not the official build, but it's even newer than that, so these are very, very new features. So first of all, before, if we had an animation of something traveling very fast through smoke, that is example of what it does now. Before, it would leave us these little dots, but now, since he's coded this, we have a option under the emitter settings to increase the subframes. So now if I increase that, it flows nice and smooth. So this is very, very handy if you have any fast-moving emitter objects. It greatly increases the quality and just looks much, much better. So another thing that he has done is allowing for full sampling of high resolution, and what that means is that now we have completely smooth smoke all the way around the emitter. So before, say if we had a simulation that looked like this, you can see that we have, smooth smoke up there, but now I have these blocky, I don't know, chunks, I suppose. And even if you increase the division size and play this back, you still get the chunks. They're smaller chunks, but they're still chunks. And you might expect that if you enabled high resolution that it would get rid of those. But while it does smooth out a little bit, you still have these lumpy kind of areas, and it just doesn't look all that good. And if you don't need to increase the division size, then it's just a waste to increase it just for that one area. So now we have an option for flow sampling. And we can change this from linear, which was the old method, to now full sample. And what this means is if you play this back, we now have a completely smooth area around the emitter, and it corresponds with the division size, and it just works very, very well. So now we don't have to worry about that blockiness, and it's really good for fire simulations and things like that, so keep that in mind. Another thing that he did was now we can set the surface of the emission object, the source of this, to 0, which means that basically nothing happens at all. And this is very, very nice because before it would have a low limit of like 0.5 or something, but now that we can set it to 0, we can keyframe it on and off, which before we couldn't do, so this is very, very handy, especially in the case of explosions. And lastly, the last thing I want to show you here is with particles. So you can see that I have this domain set to division of 32, and that works fine. Maybe that's exactly the way I want it to look, but I go ahead and maybe I want to increase the quality of the animation, so I set it to 64. But now as I play this back, all these particles are very, very small and not at all what I wanted them to look like. But now, if I again choose the emitter object, I have an option for set size. And with this, I can set the size of these particles in relation to the smoke to be as large or as small as I want, and it doesn't correspond with the division size. Now you can't set it smaller than your resolution, that wouldn't make any sense, but I can control how large they are, and it just smooths it out instead of decreasing the size. So this is very, very handy, as we'll be using a couple particle systems within our explosions. Okay, so I'm moving kind of fast here, but we have a lot to cover, so next I'm going to show you how to make a good explosion, what the difference between a good explosion and a bad explosion is. So there's this article here written by Mitchell Saul, and he worked on the Reversion short film. I highly recommend it. It was really good. And this is something that I read, and it really helped me, I don't know, just make better explosions, I guess. So here, he writes, I'll just kind of paraphrase it for you, but I really recommend you go to reversion.com or reversion.cosmunity.com and just read through this whole thing. I'll try to put a link to it in the description below, but I'm just going to paraphrase it for you here. So here we have an example of 3 different explosions, one of them bad, one of them is even worse, and one of them is very good. And the first one is bad because basically it doesn't have any sense of danger to it. It looks kind of cheesy, there's nothing exciting about it, it's just a bunch of fire, and it's just, I don't know, nothing exciting. You don't get the sense of destruction or immediate danger. This one is even worse, he says, because again, it doesn't look harmless at all, and there's no force behind it. It doesn't look very, dynamic. It's just a glowing cloud of gas. And third, we have a very, very nice explosion. And he points out that part of the reason is because there are lots of parts to it. So you can see that there's fire here, there's different kinds of smoke, there's debris flying, and it really makes it look more dangerous. Like you really don't want to be stuck in that. Well, that one looks like it might be fun to play in. So I'm going to be focusing on making the different parts of this type of explosion and how to make it so that there's lots of things going on and enough detail to make it look really convincing and exciting at the same time. And here he did a really good job outlining the stages of an explosion from a video. He just took a couple frames, and you can see here that there's a part before the blast, there's a flash of light, then you have the fireball, and then you have a little bit of dust, but then the dust starts to overtake the fire, and then the debris emerges, and then the fireball kind of collapses in on itself and stops expanding, and the debris just kind of bursts outward, and then everything's falling down, and the smoke kind of blows away. And this should be kind of our example of what should be happening and include all of these different things while we're making an explosion. So again, I recommend going through and reading this whole thing. He's using Blender 2.49 without any smoke simulation, so that's kind of an interesting approach. And he does a good job of that, but I'm going to be doing this in the smoke simulator, and hopefully it'll look very, very good when I'm done. So, that was all the preparation that we have time for, and now we'll move on to the actual tutorial itself. Alright, just before we get started, I have an example for you that I've made. It's a little bit different than the preview I posted earlier. So it's, one thing that does bug me is apparently this little dust ring didn't go far enough, but that's easy to fix. But we can pick out the few key points, which is the flash of light, the burst, you have this dust cloud, you have the debris flying, and, which by the way, those are just proxies, so it'd be pretty neat if you maybe like took that one and parented like a car to it or something, or I don't know, just different things. But it's good to have some debris in there as well. And also a couple other effects that just help it give it more impact and more feel of, danger. You definitely don't want to be stuck in something like that. That doesn't look very fun. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing I'm going to do in Blender is I'm going to press spacebar and type quick and use quick smoke. And then right after that, I'm going to delete it, choose that, and actually I'm going to go ahead and delete that as well. And the reason I just created something and then deleted it is now that even though if I add another object, say this monkey, I still have the domain material inside my material options. And by the way, we have to switch over to Blender Render because it doesn't work in cycles quite yet. But yeah, if I need to, I can just select this down here, and I don't have to go through all of the different settings, but I can still choose whatever domain I want to use. So I'm going to be using a monkey for this tutorial. That can be the basis of our little explosion here. So I'm just going to set it right on the center there, and I'm going to press Control A and apply the rotation. That way when we use our particles, they won't be going in the direction of the local coordinates, they'll be going in the direction of these arrows that we see here. And now we can add a smoke flow to that. And if you're unfamiliar with the smoke simulator, you should probably watch a few other tutorials on it before doing this one, because this one is a little bit more advanced, and I don't have time to go over all of the basics as we go. So I'm assuming you have a basic understanding of what things do. So I'm going to take this cube here, this is going to be our domain, and I'm going to scale it up about 5 times. We can use adaptive domain, so it doesn't matter exactly how big it is. So that looks very, very large. And, you know, if I have my camera, say it'll be about something like that. This is going to need to be a little bit wider, so I'm going to scale it on the X 2 times. And there we have our domain. It looks very, very big, but baking shouldn't take quite as long thanks to the adaptive domain. So now if I make this a domain, we have our smoke. But one thing that I learned is that for explosions, you definitely need some sort of burst to kind of get it started, and so surface using the mesh for the flow of this isn't going to work very well. So we're going to use a particle system. So to do that, go to the particle tab and just add a particle system. And before we make it part of the smoke simulator, we'll just edit it a little bit so it works well. And if you think about it, you know, explosion is just kind of like a explosion. It just kind of boom, bursts outward. So we're going to start this on frame 10, so we have a little bit of build-up time, so it's not immediate. And then it's also going to end on frame 10, so all the particles are going to come out all on one frame. But that looks more like it's just kind of like sliding off or something, so we need to give it a little bit of velocity. And I'm going to set this to random just to help it a little bit. Make it a little bit more random. Okay, so under velocity, change this normal value to something like 10. Let's see how that works. That looks pretty good. And then maybe 3 on the z direction, so it'll burst up a little bit, and 5 on the random direction. And that way it's going to give us a pretty fast explosion, and these particles are going to expand very, very fast until they're much, much bigger than the domain, but we don't have to have them alive that long. If I change the lifetime to something like 8 and play this back, we now have an explosion, but it stops around here. And I might even change that to 5 because I want it to be a little bit smaller. Oh, okay, there we go. There's our little puff of particles. And before we go any further, I'm going to add a plane. And I'm going to scale it up really, really big so it's at least past our camera. That's going to be important later. And I'm going to make this a collision. And by increasing the particle dampening and the particle friction, when the particles hit this, instead of just going straight through or bouncing off, they're going to be actually affected by it. So you can see how it's kind of pushing them away, but it's not bouncing them up too high. So that's definitely what we want. We get a little nice explosion. So now I can choose the particle system in the flow settings here. And there we have the basics of our explosion. Before we go any further, I'm going to turn on adaptive domain. So that'll help it go a little bit faster, and I'm going to change this to 96. Oh, I think I've done lock on. There we go. So there we have it. But instead of just smoke, since it's a fiery explosion, we're going to want to change this to fire and smoke. So that is pretty much the very, very basics of the first part of it. We just have a simple, burst of flame, but you see it kind of burns up immediately, and there's nothing really special about it. And the reason for this is that we have absolute density already checked for us automatically. But if we take this off, it's going to allow it to expand much, much more, and so it's going to last a little bit longer after the flame has already kind of died out. And so that's going to help it look a lot better a little bit later. Also, I'm going to turn on initial velocity so that the velocity of the particles actually affect the motion of the smoke. And also I'm going to turn up the subframes just a little bit so that we get a nice smooth emission. Okay, so that looks pretty good. But you might think, you know, there's a lot more to that explosion than this. I mean, while this looks fairly good, it's definitely not close to what it was before. And I think this is where a lot of people stop. They have one boom and they think it's, you know, it looks fine. But explosions, as I was talking about earlier, have a lot of different parts. And so what we're going to do now is go through the different parts of the explosion and add them all individually. So this particle system, I'm going to name this main. Just name these settings here. And then I'm going to add let's see, I'll add a circle, scale it in a little bit, go into edit mode, extrude on the z-axis, move it up to about there, and add a new particle system. I'm going to call this one spread. I don't really know what to call it, so I'm going to call it spread. And I'm going to go into side view so I can see where my domain is. And I'm going to give this particle system, oh, first of all, it needs to start the same time the other one does, so it's going to start at 10, end at 10. So it's all going to come out on the same frame. But it needs some velocity. So I'll give it a velocity of 10 in the normal direction and maybe like 5 in the random. Too much. 2 in the random and 8 in the normal maybe. You can see this is a lot of tweaking, basically what it is. Okay, so that looks good. It's well inside the domain, and it's in a nice little circular pattern there. And I think that works well. So I want them to die at about frame 25. So I'll change the lifetime to 25 and turn up the random so that they don't all die at the same time. And now, if we go and make this a smoke flow using that particle system, turn off absolute density and turn on initial velocity just out of good habit. I mean, obviously sometimes you don't want these, but in this case we do. So now we have it kind of bursting out along the ground as well as going up into the air, and it gives us a nice shape. Though I'm thinking, looking at it now, we might want to have a little bit more velocity. So maybe 15 on the normals, and while that will make it much too big, we can also turn down the lifetime to say 10 and see how that works out. There we go. So that looks pretty good, but we don't want that smoke to be as thick as the smoke up here, because this smoke is going to be, you know, directly from the explosion. This is kind of going to be dust that's being blown away, or just little parts of the smoke that's going along the ground, and so we don't want it to be as thick. And the way we change that is we can change the density here in the smoke flow settings, and I'm going to turn that down to 0.25. And now when I play this back, it's going to have much less smoke there, and it's going to work out well. So there we have the main part of our explosion, and it's already looking pretty good. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a wind effect, and you can see that in my example that I had earlier. And so to do that, I'm just going to press Shift A, add a force field and wind, and rotate it 90 degrees, negative direction, or whichever direction you want. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to change this to, let's say 4, because that seemed to work pretty well earlier. And what that's going to do is it's just going to blow the smoke away after it's, you know, kind of exploded. It's going to slowly kind of move it that way, and that just helps make it look a lot more realistic, because, you know, there's only one point on the entire Earth where there's no wind at all at any point in time, which happens to be called the Hairy Ball theorem, in case you didn't know. There's a pretty good minute physics video on YouTube. But anyway, that's totally besides the point. The point was there's always going to be wind, and you're going to want to add a little bit in because it just helps it make it look more realistic. So there we have our wind, and it's just kind of blowing it away, and it looks nice. So we'll keep that there. Next, we're going to add a few projectile parts of it. The parts that just kind of trails smoke out in little trails. So to do that, I'm going to add a sphere. Go into edit mode, delete the lower half, and scale that down. And by the way, I forgot to do this. On the particle systems that we did before, we're going to want to go to render, render nothing, display as points. That way they don't render as halo particles. And for this one, I don't want it to show up at all, so I'm going to uncheck the emitter, check none, and point. And same for this, I'm going to create a particle system, and I don't want it to render. And let's see, I don't want it to render, don't want it to render anything, and I want it to display as point. Excuse me, there we go. And so, you see it's emitting nicely. Now, if you remember our explosion lesson from that article before, you'll remember that there are kind of different steps to the explosion. So first we have the fire, and then we have the kind of smoke overtaking it, and then we have the debris coming out. So it's going to be just a fraction of a second coming after that. And so I'm going to, instead of starting at 10, I'm going to start it at 12. And I'm going to give it a little bit more velocity, and a little bit more velocity in the z direction. So it's going to fly up, higher, and we'll just see how that turns out. Maybe I want to change this to 11. Okay, I think that looks good. And I'm going to change the number. I'm going to turn that down a bit because that looks like quite a lot of smoke trails. I don't want that many. I just want a few just for, style. So I'm going to turn that down to, say, 100. And even that looks like kind of a lot, so maybe 25. I know I didn't use very many in my videos before. Okay, I think that's going to be perfect. And maybe turn down the normal a little bit because I don't want them going outside of the domain. Okay, that looks pretty cool. So now I can go and make that a smoke flow object as well using the particle system. And this is where the set size really comes in handy. So even if we up the resolution, it's still going to keep that size around the particle, which is very, very important. Okay, so you can see that that looks very, very cool with the smoke trails behind it. You get the initial explosion, but then you get those kind of parts coming out, and you see that in a lot of movies and such, and it just helps the overall look. It adds a little extra detail. It really helps it stand out, and you can see that we need to add some subframes to these because they're moving kind of fast. So I'm going to add 2 subframes. There should be plenty. You don't want to add too many. And that looks pretty good. I think that looks like a good start. And now, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this plane here, and I'm going to make it a smoke object as well, but this one's going to be a collision. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow the smoke to collide with it and react like it would on a normal ground. And what this does is, unfortunately, it traps them underneath it, but that's kind of unavoidable because it's being emitted down there. But one thing that it does do is it allows some of the smoke to kind of stick to the ground and kind of, not the smoke, sorry, some of the flame to stick to the ground and kind of burn up from there, and it just helps it look a little bit better. So that is that. Let's see, what else am I missing? I think for the explosion itself, that is pretty much all that I had. Now we can go ahead and play with the resolution of it. So for the resolution, the lower you set it, the larger the chunks you're going to get. So you can see that each of these individual chunks is going to be larger. And now that we have the full sampling for the high resolution, we can choose how high this is going to be without having to worry about the size of the particles or the blockiness of the high resolution. So this is very, very cool. But I think, let's see, let's try 96 again, because that looked pretty good. Didn't look too bad. Let's try 150, just to see how that looks. I think that looks a little bit better. Just adds more, well, I don't know. I think I'm going to stick with 96 on this one, just because I like the shape of it better, and I like how much the particles are emitting. So now that we have that done, we can turn on high resolution, and this is where it starts to get pretty slow. You know, if you don't have a very fast computer, it's going to be slow long before this, or if you have a really good computer, maybe you'll be able to push out a little bit more. But a lot of times you just kind of have to guess how things are going to go, and bake it, and then render, and then just trying to figure it out, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So now we have this, and now we have to change the vorticity here, because all of these settings here are already automatically pretty much what we want. We don't have to worry about any of that. Maybe if you want the smoke to dissolve or something, but that's not what we want. We want it to blow away. So let's change the vorticity. Turn it up just to 2.5. If you turn it up too high, it looks kind of silly. But 2.5, I've found out, is probably really good for, you know, that large scale type of smoke. And for the noise wavelet noise method down here in the high resolution, I'm going to change that to 2.5 as well. So we have a little bit more than normal, but still not so much that it looks bad. And then I'm going to turn this up to 3 for this example. Maybe you want to turn it up to 4 if you want, or maybe you even want to turn this up a little bit. I don't know, whichever you want to do. It's completely up to you. Fortunately, it bakes fairly fast with this adaptive domain on. I can tell there's some problem with this in this build, because there's a puff of smoke that's like screwing up the whole adaptive domain in these two corners. That's bothering me, but oh well. Hopefully that'll get fixed. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and bake this explosion, and after that, I'll show you a few things that'll really help sell the explosion through not just the smoke, but a few of the other effects that go along with it. So in the smoke cache, first off, I have to save the file. So save as explosion. All right. I'm only going to bake it to, let's see. So if I turn that off, how long do I want this to run? Okay, I think 125 will be perfectly fine. It doesn't need to totally clear out, especially just for an example like this. So this is only going to bake till frame 125 with the high resolution on. And now I can bake all dynamics. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. I think I'm good to go. So I'll see you in a second, because I'll pause the mic, and I'll be back in a sec. Alright, so here I have baked our simulation, and I didn't bake the entire thing just to save myself a little bit of time. I only baked it to about here, but for this purpose it should be more than enough. And again, if you want to make it really like super high quality or like close up, I recommend that in the domain settings you turn this up to maybe 150, and in the high resolution maybe turn this up to 4 or 5. But for this, in this case, this will work perfectly well, and we can move on to the next step. So you can see that we have a nice little simulation here, but it gets kind of laggy in the viewport if you leave it like that. So if you just turn off show high resolution, it's not going to look quite as good in the viewport, but you're able to move around much faster and it's much easier to work with. So now our next step is to get this rendering looking good. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the material tab here, but before I add any material to this, there's one thing that I was having trouble with before, and that was the smoke was flickering as it was moving around. And the problem is that since the adaptive domain was constantly moving and changing shape, it was kind of affecting the render and making it flicker. And I talked to Mika H about this, and he said that a good workaround is just to duplicate the domain. So I'm going to do that there, Shift D, and the first one I'm going to name domain, and the second one I'm going to name domain material. And one of these is going to be the actual domain itself, and one of them is just going to be the material for that domain. So in the domain material, I'm going to, well, first of all, I'm going to choose the domain, and I'm going to make sure this is not going to be rendered by clicking this little camera button here. It's not going to be rendered, and I'm going to give it that smoke domain material. However, in this one, I don't want it to be visible, but I want it to be rendered, and I also want it to give it the same material. So I can select this and change all the settings, but instead what it's doing is it's acting as a proxy for this one to be rendered, which seems kind of weird, but it fixes the problem, so it works out great. So with this selected, now I can go through these different options. These materials are already set up perfectly fine, but in the smoke density, some things that we're going to have to do is change this domain object, select that, and choose domain. And then in the mapping, instead of using generated, it's because that would turn out all weird because we're using a proxy, we need to use object and then choose the domain. And now when we render this, it's going to work quite well. So I'm going to do the same thing for the flame texture, and make sure map to bounds is checked on both of these. Alright, so as I went over in previous video tutorials, this first texture here affects the density, and the second one affects the flame brightness and where it is. And if you need any help with that, go back to my earlier tutorials on how to make realistic rendered fire. And as I went through that, I think it just screwed up the bake, which is unfortunate. That is too bad. Okay, so I might have to bake this again. I really hope you didn't just spend too much time doing it and then add that, because this might have messed up with the bake. But once you do it again, it should work perfectly fine. Yeah, so if we look through our camera and we render this, we now have our smoke and it looks great. So first of all, I'm going to take this light so we can actually see what's going on, turn it into a sun lamp, move it over here, rotate it around, and then render again. Okay, so you can't see this plane. We're going to do something with the material with that a little bit later, but we can see that the smoke is actually showing up and it's looking good. But so far the flame isn't showing up all that well, so I figure out what's going on with that, because it is mapped correctly. I don't think... I think it should be shown up. Oh, I forgot to choose the domain object. Silly me. Okay. There we go, perfect. And you might think that doesn't look very good, but as we go along and tweak a few settings and work in the compositor, it's going to look much, much better. So the next step that we have this kind of set up, what we can do is add a image to the background here that is going to be rendered with. And so the one I used for my test seemed to work pretty well. So I'm going to enable background images, add an image, view only through the camera, so I'm not seeing it when I'm outside the camera because that just gets in the way. And I can open it up. See, I had it in textures, scenery. It's from CD Textures, so you can download it. It was one of the arid landscapes. And I just cropped it myself in Photoshop. Okay, so there we have it. And it's inside of our scene, so we can see what angle we need to have the camera at. And we can see that we need to tilt the camera down, or rather not tilt the camera down. What am I thinking? I don't know, just kind of move it around until it matches the sort of I don't know, matches the scene. Okay. I think that should be good. So in the view, in the camera view, now we have this explosion happening on this um, backdrop, and we're going to composite in that exact image, so it's going to be behind the explosion. But what we don't want is that this part under here, we don't want that to be seen when we do the compositing. And so I'm going to add a material to this, a new material, and I'm going to call this, what am I, actually no, I'm going to call this one shadows. And since we need these shadows to show up in the compositor, I'm just going to click shadow and only shadows, or shadows only. And what that's going to do is going to make this completely transparent except for the shadows, so that when we render it, and make sure to receive transparent is on and shadows only. Some of the shadows, say if I add a cube, you might be able to see it better. So you can see that shadow is going to show up within the compositor, but everything else is completely clear, and you can't see what's underneath it. So this works very, very well. And lastly, in the scene options, I'm going to turn off sky, and that way when I render this, it's going to be transparent except for just the explosion. But maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me go on and finish the rest of it before we get to the compositing. So I just want to match the lighting a little bit. You can see that in the picture it's coming from the top left, kind of at, I'd say, this angle. And I think that's about right. But we also want some environment type lighting, so I'm going to duplicate that, move it around, change the strength to, say, 0.25, and turn this one up to 1.5. Rotate it so it's more flat, and there we go. Oh, and this one we don't want it casting any shadows, so no shadow. Alright, so before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm going to add in a couple other things that's really going to help make this scene. And one of them is the dust cloud that came out underneath the explosion, just kind of raced past the camera. And I will give full credit to Andrew Price for this, because that was in his explosion tutorial that he made a couple years back. So even though that tutorial is a little bit outdated, it still definitely serves its purpose here. So the way that he did that is just add a circle, scale it down, tab into edit mode, E to extrude, scale that a little bit, and so now we have our little circle, and we can keyframe the size of this. So at frame 10, which is when the explosion starts, at frame 10, I'm going to insert a keyframe for scale, and then on frame, how long should it take to go past the camera? Let's say 35, let's try that. And on frame 35, this is going to be about that big. So as we play this back, which let me turn off high resolution so it goes faster, and let me free all bakes so we can see what's actually going on. Okay, but you can see that this is expanding. This is kind of being slow, and one thing that you can do to speed things up is going to the smoke in the modifiers panel and just unchecking that eye, and things are going to go much faster. So you still have the particles rendering and all that, but it's not going to be as big of a deal. And just to make sure, the domain material also has a smoke domain, which is not good, not what we want, and that might have been what screwed up the bake. So there we go. Now it runs quite fast, and you can see that after the explosion, this just kind of races past the camera in that little circular form, and it looks pretty good. So now I'm going to add some particles to that object. Was it that one? There we go. I should probably get in the habit of naming this, but I'm trying to go through sort of quickly so this doesn't take like 2 hours. So then I'm going to add some particles. Remember, it started at frame 10, but it ends at frame 35, so I'm going to have this end at, say, 40. And so it's going to be kind of spreading out particles as it goes. But obviously we don't want them to last that long or fall like that, so I'm going to give them a lifetime of about 10. And so if you see this from above, it's just kind of like a little shockwave effect. Maybe even less lifetime, maybe 5. Let's try that. Alright, that looks good. And I think now that we can turn off the gravity and the field weights. Turn it down, maybe not off completely, because we don't want it, falling down too much or going through the floor. Because that's another thing we need to be careful of. Because if it goes underneath the floor, we're not going to be able to see the particles. So just make sure you drag that up a little bit till about there. And now they'll stay on top. And maybe if I give them a little bit of more normal velocity, maybe they'll go upwards a little bit. Maybe I need to flip direction of the normals. Let's try that. There we go, flipping the direction worked. And turn the gravity, say, to 0.5, and that way it'll give us a nice little rolling effect. So, boom, there's our dust cloud there. And each of these little points is going to be a point of smoke, and so we're going to need a lot more particles in this. And let's turn that up right now to, say, 100,000 to start. 100,000. And it seemed to be a little bit thick when it got bigger, so I'm going to take this outside ring by alt-clicking it and just scaling it down. See, there we have a nice little cloud of dust. Boom. As seen from by the camera, you can see that just kind of races past. I'm going to turn this up to 8 and then turn on the random so they don't all die at the same time. Okay, that looks pretty good. But if we tried and render this, it would look very, very bad because it's just a bunch of halos. However, we can change this to make the halos exactly what we want to look like. So let's go in the material panel, and I'm going to name this dust, and I'm going to turn that to halo. And the particles are going to automatically mimic this. So as I change this, it's going to change the particles as well. So the alpha, I'm going to turn that down to 0.25 so it's not as visible, and the hardness down to, say, 10. So as you can see, if we render it now, they're much, much softer. You don't get those points as much. Maybe I need to turn down the hardness even more. Yeah, and then it just looks a lot softer. But they're definitely way too big, so I'm going to turn that down to, say, 0.05. Let's try 0.01. And I'm going to turn on soft just to help us out with the soft feeling of this. I'm feeling like it's not mimicking the size of this. Maybe in the render tab it needs to... Yeah, it should render as a halo using the first material. Maybe it just needs an update, because sometimes that happens where you just need to update the cache or something. So I'll play this back. Boom. Okay, that's probably what it just needed, a little update like that. Okay, so now we can more accurately look at the size of this. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like. And you see that we might need a little bit more particles, but something that like that looks fairly good. You know, even if you turn that down and maybe turn that up, let's just kind of test out what this looks like. There we go. That looks like some nice dust just being kicked up. Very blurry, which is good. And I'm going to turn that up to 400,000. And I'm going to save, because sometimes working with large particles is hard on the system. Okay, so as this blows past, we're going to get this nice cloud of dust racing past the camera, and it's going to look very, very cool. So, in order for our system to not completely slow down as we're going through this, in the display settings, I can choose to, first of all, I don't want to render the emitter, so uncheck that. I can turn this down to, say, 25, and it's going to render only 25% of those particles. Which is, when you're talking about 4,000, still kind of a lot. Or 1%, let's see. Does that actually speed it up, or does that just change the display? I think that just changes the display. So I'm going to leave that at 50%, so it speeds it up a little bit, but not too much. But if I uncheck that... Ah, excuse me. Sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. That was kind of awkward. I just burped in the middle of a tutorial. That's awkward. Alright, that looks good. Now we have that little dust cloud. Excuse me while I get a drink. Okay, you have a dust cloud, we have an explosion, and we are pretty much set to go except for a few minor things. One other particle system that I'm going to add, because I bet you were sitting there and you were like, hey, you know what, I think we don't have enough particle systems. I'm sure you weren't thinking that because we have a ton. But I'm going to add a ecosphere just so we can differentiate from the regular sphere, and delete these lower vertices there. Now I'm going to rotate it so it's facing the camera. And what this is going to do is it's going to just kind of spray the camera with dirt and stuff. So I'm going to add a particle system to that. I'm going to name this dirt. I have been not very good at naming my particle systems so far, but that's alright in this case. And again, we want this to start at frame 11 and end at frame 11 or 12, somewhere around there. And velocity, we're going to want a pretty good amount in the normal velocity, maybe like 2 in the random, but mostly we want it on the negative y direction. And since I rotated this in object mode, you can see that the local coordinates of this are not the same as the global coordinates. So what I need to do is press Control A and apply rotation. That way when I change the direction of this, it's going to you know, spray it in that direction instead of that direction. So I'm going to change this to -15, and we'll see how that goes. Douche. Maybe I need to bring that above the plane so it doesn't go through. Okay, it looks like it needs a little bit more help. So 8 on the normal, 5 on the random, and -25 on the y. That almost made it, so let's up the Z a little bit so there's more kind of like falling down on the camera as well. And it obviously needs to be alive the entire time, so I'm going to change lifetime to 250. Almost there. Velocity, let's see. Change that to -30, now a little bit more in the Z direction. And now when we play this back, we're going to get a nice shower of whatever. And now that I think about it, that's actually not quite correct because it's not going to be blasting straight out like that. That would look a little bit funny. What we need to do is come up and then rain down on the camera. So, my mistake. Let me change that back to -15. And we need it to go a little bit higher in the Z direction. And we also don't want it to be affected by the wind that much. So in the force field settings, or no, sorry, field weights, we turn down the wind to about 0.5%, or 0.5%, that didn't make any sense, to about half, and that way it'll actually go past the camera and it's going to fall and kind of rain down on the camera as the explosion is happening. So that's going to look very cool. And what we can do now is add another object, say, in this case, I'm just going to add an ecosphere. You could probably make it look a whole lot better. And I'm just going to make a very simple rock. Scaled in on the Z. Move some vertices around. And I'm going to call that a rock. And you can go ahead and texture this so it looks like the ground. But in this case, since, there's still a little bit more I have to cover, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I'm sure you know how to texture things, and if you don't, there's plenty of tutorials on that. So, in the particle settings for this object, I'm going to go under Render, Render Object, and Ecosphere. Ooh, Ecosphere 01. There we go. And I'm going to save this. So now, when I play this back, all of these particles are little ecospheres. And it looks funny because they're all facing the same direction, so I can go into rotation, check that, make sure that is turned to random, change the phase, make that random, and choose dynamic. That way when we play this again, it should all be, going in random directions and rotating through the air. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So now we have an explosion, we have some dust going out, and we have some particles coming at us, raining past the camera, making it look like an actual explosion. So all very, very cool, but there's just one more thing that I would like to add because it helps add to the feel of destruction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this plane here and I'm going to add yet another physics thing to it. I'm going to make it a passive rigid body. I'm going to leave that on this layer and go to the next one, and I'm going to add a cube. Alright, so in side view and in edit mode, I'm just going to scale this along the y-axis a little bit. Scale it down, bring it up, and I'm going to pretend with my imagination that this is a truck. And what this could be is just a proxy for a truck, and what that means is that this is a very, very simple model. Obviously it's a cube, probably the simplest model of a truck you could ever get. But what you could do now is you could parent the truck to that, so as I make this a rigid body, and as I have something that hits this and collides with it and this falls over, the truck is going to be parented to it, so you don't have all of the geometry slowing down the simulation. Instead, you're just simulating the cube, but it looks like the truck is being hit by the explosion. So that is a active rigid body, and I'm going to make maybe some barrels with just a simple cylinder, and you could make this a whole lot more complex if you want, but I'm trying to keep it simple for the time being. And if you want to make it look super cool by adding some boards or something, I don't know, whatever you want to do, that would be awesome and I would love to see it. Okay, so then I'm going to select these, maybe duplicate them a little bit, and just so we have some more interesting things to look at, I'm going to duplicate this as well. Maybe scale it up, scale that one down, and these are really, really big for barrels in comparison to that truck, so I'm going to scale those down, scale these down as well. Okay, and now I need to make these rigid bodies, so I'm just going to select those, make sure I have an active object, go to rigid body tools and add active. Simple as that, and now when we play this back, we have a rigid body scene, and it's resting on the ground on this layer. So now we need to have an actual explosion that kind of forces these things out of the way. But one thing that I found is that if you use the smoke force field, it doesn't quite work exactly like you'd think. And if you use a normal force field, it pushes it evenly in all directions, and so it doesn't make these things kind of crash around each other. So one thing that you can do is just add a normal sphere, and on frame 10, I'm just going to keyframe the scale, and then say on frame 20, I'm going to make it very, very big. About there, and insert keyframe for scale. And I'm going to make sure that this doesn't render, so I'm going to go to the object here and make sure it's not rendered, so we don't have this huge sphere, because that would be very ugly and obtrusive. Okay, so I'm going to make that a rigid body and make sure I check animated. And if I play this back, now we have it kind of knocking those things out of the way. But it looks like it doesn't expand fast enough or large enough, so I'm going to go to frame 20, press Alt-I, delete that keyframe, go to frame 15, and make it even bigger, about there. Insert scale. Then as I play this back, we now have an explosion that knocks away those objects. And obviously a truck isn't going to be blown away as much as a barrel, so I'm going to select that truck and make the mass something like 150. I'm going to do the same with this one, 150. And this one maybe 75. That way, when I play this back, they won't be knocked nearly as much, or maybe they will. Maybe need to turn that up even more. What does 500 do? Maybe 1,000? Okay, that looks better. Turn that to 1,000, make that about 250. And if we play this back, now we just have these things being knocked out of the way. And if you wanted to make it more stationary, you could up the mass something much, much higher. And even though, I guess since this is being scaled, this mass is all weird. But anyway, the main point is that we have these things being knocked out of the way, and it just gives to this sense of, it adds to the sense of destruction, like something's actually being, like, destroyed, because that's what explosions do. So, if we go ahead and go to the modifier, make sure we can see that. Save, so nothing weird happens, and play this back, we now have an explosion. This, I'm going to make it a wire so we can see through it. We're going to have a nice explosion, blows these little chunks. It has some particles that make a shockwave, and now we have some debris raining down on the camera. All in combination to make a very cool explosion. So now we are almost done, but what I'm going to do now is go to the render settings to show you how to render the smoke. Alright, so if we rendered this right now as it is, we can see that it doesn't look very good. So before, we had already done the smoke and the fire that was already set up with the quick smoke, and it worked quite well. But the rest of this doesn't look very good, and it's not going to integrate very well into any sort of backdrop that we have. But first, before we do that, let me actually go in and add the backdrop. Oh wow, I can't talk. Okay, backdrop. There we go. So we can see what we're working towards. So if I go to the compositing workflow there, I can check use nodes and backdrop. And then if I control shift click, we get our image there. And now I can add an input image, choose the image that we had, and then use a color and alpha over to combine these two together. And you can see this one is way too big, so all I need to do is go to distort and scale, and then set this to the render size. That way it's going to be automatically the same size as the this render. So this is looking pretty good, but as I said, it doesn't integrate very well. Like, this white doesn't look like dust, those don't look like rocks, and everything just looks kind of all around bad. So what we can do to fix this is, first of all, let's make the dust sort of a sandy color. So select that object, make sure we have that material. Excuse me, and let's just try making this a little bit better of a color. And then we can render it out and see how it looks. Okay, so it looks like it needs to be a little bit darker than that. Maybe a little bit more saturated towards the orange. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. You can mess with it a little bit more if you want, but I think that looks fine as it is, because we'll only be seeing it very briefly. It'll be a very quick, transition. So next, I'm going to address the weird shading on some of these objects, and that's because they don't have any material applied, and also they don't have received transparent shadows. So I'm just going to call this proxy, because really these are proxy models for other things like, say, cars or crates or something like that. But since we're going to be rendering them out here, I'm just going to make this quick, simple material. Lower the specular so it doesn't look all funny, and just make sure they have received transparent checked. And then I can select all of these other objects here. Not that one. Nope. That one. That one. Not that one. All of those, and finally that one last. And then when I hit spacebar and copy material and choose copy material to others, all of these will have that material automatically applied. So when I render it out, they no longer have those weird shadows. You can see they're lit like they should be. So now we're almost done. We just need to fix these kind of rocks up there, and I think it looks kind of funny to have that many, and they're much too big. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select those, and it looks like they are baked. So where's the cache? Free just this one, because I don't want to free all of the bakes. And I'm going to turn this down to, say, 250. And then under render, I'm going to turn down the size, maybe 0.025. Or actually, let's leave it at 0.05, but then turn on the random size, which will make some of them smaller, and we'll get a more varied amount. So let's play this back. We have those, and they still come up and go past the camera, but it's not quite as many as before, and it'll just look a little bit better. Okay, so we still need to change the color of those, so let's go ahead and do that. That'll be in this layer here. I think I moved the object somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, but I remember it was in ecosphere, I believe. Maybe it was on this layer. Let's see. Yep, there it is. And then I will go to the material panel, add a new material real quick. Just turn down the specular, give it a new texture, image or movie, and I'm going to give it the same as our background so we can get the colors exactly. Then in the UV editing here, I just have a few preset window layouts. It's just the UV image editor and the 3D view. I can choose that, go into edit mode, select everything, press U and unwrap. That's going to make everything look really funny, and you can see in the textured view that doesn't look very good, or it just doesn't show up at all for some reason. Maybe if I turn on GLSL. Nope, I don't know. Okay, but anyway, that looks really funny, but if you do U and sphere projection, that'll look a little bit better. And then just move it somewhere where it's kind of flat. And, you know, it might not look perfect, but for now, since it's just a really small object, uh, and all we need is really the color of the ground, then just doing that simple little thing will help it. Oh, that's because that's a world texture. I don't want that to be a world texture. There we go. So I want it to influence the color, maybe the normal by like 0.05, and make sure to choose the UV for the UVs that we just unwrapped. And now when we render this, it should take on the same color as the ground. So there we go. Maybe I'll turn down the intensity a little bit, but that should be uh, perfectly fine. There we go. I think that looks good. And now lastly, you can tell that the smoke obviously does not look like the rest of the dust. It looks kind of gray and out of place. So what we can do is change the reflection color. So let's try changing that to something a little bit more sandy, sort of like we did for the halo material. And you can tell that that didn't change it a whole lot. It just changed the reflection color of the sun reflecting off of it. However, the transmission color did not change. So let's change the transmission color. There we go. That's looking a lot better. Still, I want it a little bit more dusty. It still looks a little bit gray to me. Okay, well that should be fun. We can tweak it in the compositor, no problem. So I wouldn't worry about it too much at this point. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up the light cache to I'll go 150 just for this, and it'll take a little bit longer to render, but it'll end up looking much better. Let's see, flame. Instead of having that being black, I'm going to change that to something a little bit more sandy color like we were going for. And I think that'll help it a little bit as well. And you can see it's taking more time to pre-cache the volume, but if you watch the how to render large-scale smoke tutorial, then you'll remember that that's one of the big things on how to make good-looking smoke. Okay, there we go. Changing the flame texture definitely helped a little bit. Alright, so now we can go ahead and start our compositing. So right off the bat, it doesn't look all that great, but when we go into the compositor and kind of mess around with it, it'll definitely look a bit better. So we can take the render layers at first. This is just our smoke right now, and we can add in a color and RGB curves. And then when we're tweaking this, these areas up here means the brighter values, and this area down there means the darker values. So if you want to increase the brightness of the brights and make the darkers dark, you can do that. But I'm just going to bring the values up a little bit so they more closely match the color of the ground. And it looks like it needs a little bit more red in there. Definitely not that much. And let's try a little bit more yellow. and this is looking much too saturated, but that's okay because we're definitely going to be fixing that a little bit later. But you can see that now it actually matches the ground. And we can use an RGB curves to fix the ground color as well, because you can see that even though it looks good, we could tweak these colors and just make it the overall image look a little bit better in and of itself. Kind of like a little bit of pre-color correcting. So there we go, now they fit together a little bit better. And now I'm going to add a glare to this, but you won't be able to tell a huge difference now because the explosion's already passed. Okay, sorry about that. Blender just crashed on me, but luckily it auto-saves every 5 minutes, so I was able to easily duplicate the things that we just did. So the only thing I changed is I made these a little bit smaller because I think it looks better. But yeah, right where we left off, I was just going to go to a frame that had more explosion in it, and when I was doing this, I realized we needed to add a little bit more emission strength to this. So I'm going to crank this up to about 10, and then I'll go ahead and render. Okay, so here we have it. I believe the compositing should be very similar to what we had, just a color correction for the, or RGB curves for the explosion itself, and then just a little bit of correcting for the ground. Now in the explosion I'm going to add a glare, so I'm going to do that by adding filter glare, changing this from streaks to fog glow. That's just going to give the explosion a nice little all-around glow. And maybe turn up the threshold just a little bit so we don't get anything else in there, just that glow. Alright, and now to add a little bit extra glare to it, what I found works pretty nice is not by adding a blur, that's not what I meant. Filter glare, add another one, but this time on the other side of the nodes, so it's after these two images are already combined, and then taking this and changing it to ghosts. And then if you change the mix to 1, you'll see what's being affected. And I obviously don't want it to be that strong, so I can turn up the threshold a little bit. Maybe about there. And then turn down the iterations, and let's see how that looks. So I think that'll look alright, and then we can also do one other thing, which is add the little lens flare effect that I had at the in the preview. So I can duplicate this, and then instead of ghosts I can use streaks, and then I'm going to change this from 0 all the way to 1, so it's just rendering the streaks. And then I'm going to turn up the threshold to where it's just going to affect the explosion part of it, and then add a filter blur and blur it just along the x-axis. Maybe I want to turn that up a little bit higher. Okay. Now I can take a color and mixed node and mix these two images, but instead of using a mix, we're going to add them together, and so it's just going to overlay that kind of glare on top of the image. Now it's looking like maybe I added a little bit too much light, too much emission to the material, so let's go ahead and see what happens if we turn it down a little bit. Let's go with like 6 or so. Okay, and a little bit farther along, let's see how that works. Because it matters more what it looks like during these stages than the other ones, and I'll show you why in just a second. Okay, so yeah, so you're seeing we're not really getting much of a glare or much of a emission, and what we can do is turn up the intensity of this texture here to add a little bit more white and beige. So if I turn that up to 1.5 and re-render. Sorry, this is a lot of tweaking, but that's pretty much how to make an explosion, is like 80% tweaking. Pretty much what it is. Okay, so now if we go back to our compositing, we can see the threshold for these things and more accurately tweak them. Okay, so that's, we might want to lower that a bit. Okay, I think that should be good. And then, oh, I need to change that back to 0. Okay, that looks good. And then this, you can see the threshold is way too high, so we can lower that back to, let's try 1, maybe 0.5. There we go. And of course, I forgot to change the mix back. That'll affect everything. Okay. Back to 1. 1 will do well. And now I have a little bit better of a glare. But you can see that everything is a little bit too much saturated even before it goes in. So I'm going to add a color hue saturation value. Desaturate this just a little bit. Let's try 0.9. That looks a little bit better. And then as it blows up, it'll get a little bit more gray as the flare kind of works itself out. Okay, so that's looking much better. And let's see, what else was there? There was let's actually, oh yeah, one very important step. So you know how in explosions you get this kind of bright flash of light? We talked about that at the beginning, and that's a very important thing that we need to have. And so we need to find exactly where the explosion starts. So if we go, I know it starts at frame 10, but let's say it kind of starts, let's say it starts around frame 11. So all the way back back here before the glare or any of that, I'm going to add a color and another hue saturation value. And you can see if I turn this all the way up, it's just going to make a big flash. And that's pretty much what we want. So I'm going to render the frame that we have. And that's what it's going to look like for that brief flash. So on frame 10, I don't want any of this happening. So I'm going to turn the factor down to 0 and insert a keyframe there. Actually, now let's go ahead and make that on frame 9. Insert a keyframe for 0, a factor of 0. Then on frame 11, a factor of 1, where it's all going to be washed out. And then on 13, another factor of 0. So we're going to have a very brief flash of light, and then it's going to go into that explosion. But not only is there a flash of light, but it also, I think it looks kind of cool if you have like a some sort of effect that makes it really stand out. So I'm going to add a filter and a directional blur. Where is that? There we go. And you can see if I zoom in, say 0.25, you can see what it does. And if I up the iterations, it'll look much better. And I want it to be centered around the explosion, so I can take down the Y a little bit until it's right there. That looks pretty good. And I'm also going to keyframe this. So about frame 10 when it starts, this is going to have a, well, actually let's go with frame 9 again. This is going to have a factor of 0. And then on frame 12, let's take this up to 0.2. Let's see what that looks like. So we don't want it too strong, just strong enough. Okay, let's go with 0.05. And then on frame 15, we can take that back down to 0. So we're just going to have this quick, sort of like a, I don't know how to explain it, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where it just gives it more of a dynamic feel, because you know when you turn this up, it just feels action-y, like something's happening. I don't know how else to explain it, but that should turn out quite well. And the flash will just help it, I don't know, look more. So then I'm going to render a few frames out of here just to make sure that all of the frames look good, not just that one. Okay, again, that looks like it could use more glare. So let's see what's happening with that. Okay, because we definitely want it to glow a bit more. Maybe I'll turn this emission back up to 10. Sorry, I'm kind of going back and forth, but like I said, it's pretty much all tweaking at this point, and just trying to make it look as good as possible. There we go. Now we have a nice glare right there. Okay, just one more test just to make sure that we're on track. We'll choose one where it's just all smoke and no flame at all. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And now we can do our final color correction. So I'm going to choose one where there's, you know, kind of in the middle, right about there. And again, just to reiterate, for a final rendering, I would go in and set your divisions a little bit higher, use a high resolution of 3 or 4, and when you're doing your final rendering, use a light cache of maybe 250, and it'll look much better, but just for the sake of time, I will leave it at 100 so it doesn't take forever. Okay, so now I have these combined nicely. If we do some color correcting on it now, it'll help just tie things in together. So I'm going to add a, let's see, RGB curves. Just one more just to do some final tweaking to get the atmosphere of it looking the way we want. Add a little bit more contrast, make it a little bit brighter. Maybe for the blues, when it's where it's really bright, we want to make it a little bit more yellow, a little more blue where it's darker. Whatever you want to do. So just anything that really helps it tie in. I think maybe the explosion might be a little bit too light, so maybe if I take this down some. So we want it to match the background there. Okay. I think that'll be perfectly fine. And lastly, I'm going to add a vignette. So the easy way to do that is just add a vignette and ellipse mask. Make sure the width is just about to 1, and the height is somewhere around there. Oh, I can get it. There we go. And then add a color mix node. Stick these two together, and instead of using mix, we're gonna have multiply. And so you can see we have the starting of a vignette there. And then finally a filter and a blur. Relative X aspect correction, somewhere around 22, 23. Actually, let's go 33. Okay, so there you have it. We could obviously still do a little bit more tweaking here and there, but I'm going to leave it off here. I'm sure you can play with it more as you wish. Try different backgrounds, try different explosions. One thing I recommend is just trying it by yourself once and playing around with it. Maybe adding some different debris, maybe adding a secondary explosion, maybe 5 frames after the first one to give it more of a dynamic feel. So just play around, look at some good explosions on the internet, and have fun with it. And so thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.